You were born deaf. You grew up in a deaf childhood in a deaf household, and you can sign language very well. Should you take cochlear implants? Cochlear implants will allow you to hear much more than you would have before, but some people have called them a cultural genocide. Why would they use these words? Because deaf people fought very hard for their identity of deafness, and they would rather not have deafness be treated as a disease or as an illness, which some would say cochlear implants or fixing their deafness would imply. So, should you take cochlear implants? Lauren Poole, Ellie Poole would call that a transformative experience. That is, it's an experience where you can't just weigh up the goods and the bads, but instead you must make the choice authentically. We'll talk more about that very soon. The big picture, what is this video about? This will be the first in a two-part series, and this topic will have 4 parts, covering Lauren Poole's book, Transformative Experience, and Lauren Poole is a professor at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. The first part will be, what is a transformative experience? The second part will be, should we undergo one? And then in the next video, I'll have a deep dive into the topic of whether parenthood is a transformative experience, and also talk about some criticisms of the idea in general. So let's begin. Part 1. What is a transformative experience? For Lauren Poole, an experience is transformative if it is epistemically transformative as well as personally transformative. What does that mean? Well, something is epistemically transformative if the only way to know about it is to actually have undergone it. An example is seeing red for the first time. So the red here, if you've never seen red before, you won't know what the color red will actually look like until you actually see it. You can read as many books as you want, but until you see the color red, you won't know what it is. So that's epistemically transformative. Epistemic just means knowledge. Personally transformative means it changes your core values. So it will change your fundamental beliefs and your passions and your desires and your wants and your values, beliefs, desires, preferences, any of those words. If it changes those, then it becomes personally transformative. If you have something that is both epistemically as well as personally transformative, then you would have what Lauren Poole would call a transformative experience. So there's a lot to unpack in this, so let's go through some examples with a Venn diagram. I have here a bunch of experiences, and we're going to sort them now into whether they're epistemically transformative, personally transformative, or both. I've got 11 experiences, and the ones with the little red X's, these are experiences that Poole herself talks about, or they're in the teaching guide on her website. So cochlear implants, they would be epistemically transformative. You won't know the feeling of not being deaf unless you get a cochlear surgery, presumably. And it will also be personally transformative. You might value deaf culture less or music more or something of that type. So it's both. It's a transformative experience. Having a child would be epistemically transformative because you won't know what the experience is like of having kids unless you actually have one, says Poole. And it will also be personally transformative because you might value sleep less. That's the example she gives, and she gives a bunch more. But for example, before you have kids, you might value sleep quite a bit. But after having kids, you might go through a few sleepless nights, and you will be more fine with that after having a kid than before having one. So therefore it's both. It's a transformative experience. Reading a sappy romance book would not be epistemically or personally transformative. Presumably it doesn't really change what you know, and it doesn't change any of your core values. You probably know what's in the book anyways without having read it. On the other hand, reading a powerful work of fiction could be personally transformative. It might change your values. You might become a communist or a Marxist if you're reading Marx or any other work. But it might not be epistemically transformative. It might not change what you know otherwise. Although that's debatable, at least in Poole's teaching guide, this is personally transformative. And I would argue it might even be epistemically transformative, but at the very least, it is personally. Eating a biscuit would not change what you know. You probably already know what it tastes like, and it doesn't change any of your core values. So I would just chuck that aside as well. It's like a sappy book. It's not transformative. Eating a durian, though, a durian is this, what I think is a delicious fruit from Southeast Asia, but some people think otherwise. You won't know the taste of durian unless you actually have it. So it's epistemically transformative. But Poole would say it doesn't actually change any of your fundamental preferences or beliefs. Preferences or values. Chuck it there. Watching apostrophe philosophy videos is clearly a life-changing experience. So this is both epistemically as personally transformative, stuck in the middle with the rest. Going to a new country, you won't know what the feeling is like unless you actually go to a new country, and it might change some of the values. So it's a transformative experience.
S'il vous plaît.
Other examples of transformative experiences she gives are becoming a vampire, getting married, and changing careers. For example, a doctor. A quick clarification. Some experiences could be transformative for some people, but not others. For example, she says, for a baby, almost every experience might be transformative. So if you're a baby eating a biscuit, it might be such a whole wildly new experience that for you that is epistemically transformative. And it might really change your personal values. So, ooh, I love food, right? That's a brand new personal core value change that you might have. So really, there's some flexibility in these accounts. So it depends on who you are and the context. So hopefully that's cleared up what Paul means when she talks about transformative experiences. Now let's talk about how we can decide whether to undergo one. So you're a deaf person, and you're deciding whether to get cochlear implants. Paul actually considers the case of if you're a child and the parents are choosing on your behalf, but for simplicity's sake, let's assume that you're the deaf one, pretend deaf adult getting a cochlear implant. The ordinary way, which philosophers presumably believe in, which Paul is fighting against, is to use normative decision theory. So you would do a rational choice, which is essentially just a expected value calculation. So you must weigh the good and the bad, or the benefits and the harms and pros and cons. So I've crafted an example here. So there's two cases, either you don't get it or you do get it. If you don't get it, then there's a baseline of maybe 100 well-being points. So you get 100 well-beings if you don't get the cochlear implant. On the other hand, if you do get it, then there's a whole bunch of different outcomes that can happen, and they all have an assigned probability, as well as a benefit or harm. For example, there's a 3/4 chance that you lose your connection to the deaf community, and I give that a -50 to your well-being. So Paul says, all these calculations are fine if you are not in a transformative experience, but if you are in a transformative experience, then there are three major problems. Firstly, it's epistemically transformative. That means that you don't know what the outcome will be like until you actually go through it. So these numbers might change around, and also some outcomes might be there, and some outcomes might not be there. Secondly, this is personally transformative. So that means what you value might change, so some of those numbers might become bigger, smaller, and likewise, some outcomes might not be there, etc. And thirdly, just reading books and statistics and talking to others who went through the surgery is not sufficient for Paul. She is very not impressed by using third-person information when making these choices. She does think it plays an important part, but she doesn't think that should be the sole way to make these choices. One of the reasons, she has many reasons, one of the reasons is what she calls a fundamental identification problem. Essentially, the problem states that no empirical data could ever give a fine-grained enough account of how you as an individual would change when faced with a transformative experience. To quote, "The fundamental identification problem makes it clear that it is not possible to collect data in the truly individual sense that we want when, as individuals, we face our big life choices. The best social scientists can ever do is evaluate individuals as members of groups with certain identifying characteristics and compare members of the group who undergo the event to members of the group who do not." So for Paul, this doesn't work. You can't use ordinary decision theory when making these transformative experience choices. So her alternative is authenticity. Note she uses the word authenticity differently than some other philosophers might use it, like Sartre. For her, authenticity is, and it's a bit long-winded, so bear with me, authenticity is self-governance informed by knowledge under subjective modes of presentation. That is knowledge via experiential or imaginative acquaintance with the objects of deliberation from the teaching guide. What? Well, it basically just means you should make a choice using your imagination or experience as your guide. Another example I've made. So, in this case, you're choosing whether to become a doctor. And here's a quote. "You shouldn't become a doctor merely because it will make your parents happy and because you'd make a bunch of money. And you shouldn't become a doctor merely because it helps other people. All of these considerations carry weight, of course. But what also matters, in this case, is what you want. Perhaps you would rather live in a city and study drama or painting. Maybe you want to be a physicist, biologist, concert violinist. If you use third-person knowledge to come to this conclusion of being a doctor, for example, ask your mum or a guidance counselor or read books, then you'd be inauthentic, according to Paul, if you just use that. And intuitively, it feels like you're making a mistake. Basically, for Paul, choose in such a way that your choices wouldn't feel like a mistake, and choose what you actually want to do. She also suggests one way to potentially recover the extended value calculation by reconfiguring your decision. Quote, instead of constructing the decision in terms of what it's like to taste a durian, you can choose to try the durian based on whether you want to have a new fruit experience for its own sake. That is solely for the expected value of discovering the intrinsic nature of this type of experience, good or bad. So this is a way to reconfigure the decision to make it rational. The teaching guide calls this the discovery solution. I'm not too convinced by the discovery solution, but I'll say more about that in the next video. This has been a brief and broad overview of Paul's transformative experience. In the next video, I'll have a deeper dive into one particular transformative experience that interests me, which is parenting. Paul says parenting is a transformative experience. I will say there's some truth in that, though the answer is not so simple. I will also start to critically analyze Paul's views on transformative experience and how we should respond to them. Until next time.